Hello and welcome to Joko Yo. Hey y'all. Hey, I gotta say, I like millions of people, like so many of us. I'm a huge fan of the TV show Young Sheldon, even preferring it to the parent show from which it came, The Big Bang Theory, which is not bad in itself. It's kind of funny, but I love Young Sheldon, the TV show, and I don't know who doesn't. I mean, you may be one of those weirdos, but whatever. And I don't think that it's that I identify with Sheldon. Not really, but maybe. This main character, Sheldon, is far too smart for me. But like him, I do often feel like the prevailing sentiments of many of my neighbors and myself don't exactly match. And if you know me, you know that's the case. I'm sure, um, I'm sure that's probably the biggest draw for me for this TV show. Um, Other characters make me happy too. For example, I in my job as a high school history teacher, I meet Georgies every day. I mean, if you live here, you know. If you know, you know. My own sister is on the show too. Not really, but my sister is like Missy. Not literally, of course, but the two are so similar in my mind when she was a kid that it may as well be her. Of course, they did not go on to make the same exact life decisions, but as children, yeah. The mother and father are good characters that I see elements of myself in both of them as well. And I can see, I mean, I see them. I see these people. Dr. Sturgis, he's more of a supplementary character, but I can so identify with this guy sometimes. I've, Again, in teaching history, sometimes I'm like, I don't know if I'm speaking the same language as my clientele, but without a doubt, my favorite character on this show is Connie, also known as Meemaw. The sass, the smarts, the not knowing quite what to make of Sheldon or of Georgie, but for a different reason. I mean, that role was so well cast. In case you don't know, the actor for Connie slash Meemaw is Annie Potts, and she is Meemaw Connie. She is that character. I cannot imagine anyone else playing her. I mean, you know who she is, Annie Potts. She was in Designing Women. She was in Ghostbusters. She's been everywhere. She's even the voice for Bo Peep in the Toy Story franchise. I mean, the quirkiness, the inventiveness. There's really no other show that I can think of that's quite like this. It does stuff. I mean, the premise alone is unique. It's it's about that proverbial thinking outside the box, the stubbornness, the loyalty. Georgie and his Meemaw Connie are always trying to be entrepreneurs. Some would say they scheme, but I will say they're always showcasing that entrepreneurial spirit. And it's that spirit that ideas that come from. And while not all ideas change a person's world, some do, even if it's in small ways and in small places. Like this guy, and of course, I'm going to segue into Johnston County history because, I mean, that's what this podcast is. So, like this guy, Samuel, entrepreneurial spirit, no doubt. Legend has it that this guy, Samuel, lived in Smithfield. Now, I need to put aside a couple of things before I go too far into this. Samuel, legend has it he was from Smithfield. Every one of these podcast episodes is meticulously researched. I spend so much time making sure that what I tell you is accurate. And and this episode alone, I have no idea how many sources I went through to make sure that the information, as all of this information, is researched thoroughly. And if I ever make a mistake, I go back and I say I made a mistake. But I make sure that as much as I can, that I research so much. I have no idea. I look at newspapers, census records, land records to make sure I'm telling you. And the reason why I tell you that is that the legend has that this guy Samuel lived in Smithfield. I have not seen census records that indicate that, but it does not mean that he didn't. There's because census records are every 10 years. There may be gaps in between, but either way, I'm going to go on legend because there's another connection to Johnston, even if it's not him. But again, legend has this guy Samuel lived in Smithville. What has it got to do with anything? Well, here's this. There used to be a boat, and this is not in Johnston County at all, but there used to be a boat. Well, in the previous episode to this one, we talked about the Bay Lakes. Well, this concerns a Bay Lake as well. In this case, the Bay Lake it mentioned is Lake Waccamaw. And in July of 1897, we see mentions in the Robinsonia newspaper. We see mentions in newspapers in Whiteville in Columbus County. There's mentions of a boat called the Bohemian Girl. And this boat was built by our guy Sam that I was just mentioning. Bohemian Girl was used to pull shingles, cypress shingles, across Lake Waccamaw um, from cutting site to mill on the other side before small rail lines came to the area, switched to or supplementing. They sometimes carried tourists across or on fishing expeditions, as Bohemian Girl did. Bohemian Girl was steam powered, not strong enough to haul shingles itself, but could tow ferries possibly. But again, it pretty much served commercial passengers. Now, before and during the 1950s and even into the 1800s, Columbus County was a site of considerable turpentine and timber production and was the dominant industry of the county. Enough turpentine being done from there that a turpentine equipment company started here whose products were sold worldwide in the 1880s. Same thing with cypress shingles, with Waccamaw cypress shingles being found nationwide, famed for their durability and their water resistance. Um, as far as we know, we can see that census records. What's this got to do with Sam? Well, you see, we can see from census records that Sam lived with his father Robert at some point, and Robert was a telegraph operator in the very early days of telegraphing. Now, um, the first telegraph message ever was sent by Samuel Morse in 1844. Well, our guy Samuel was born in 1847, just 3 years later. The census shows father Robert as being a telegraph operator before the American Civil War in 1860, with his son Samuel living with him and learning the cutting edge tech of telegraphing. Could you even imagine? They lived with some people in Wilmington, with the head of household being listed with the occupation of railroad manager. The tech was new, brand new, but history shows us just how big a deal it was, and our guys were right out front, Robert and son Samuel. Such a fortunate decision for Robert to show his boy Sam how to do this. Imagine how handy that skill and knowledge would be to a young kid, say at the age of 13. At the age of 13, how to operate a telegraph, the cutting edge communications equipment technology in the world, at the forefront of technology at such a young age. That's bound to get noticed, and spoiler alert, it sort of was. Now, I have no idea how it happened. I got no clue. Sam did not write an autobiography that could shed light on the details, but somehow this wonder child and his telegraphing skills got noticed by the Army. See, when he was turning 13, born in 1847, in 1860, at just the time, well, add 13 to 1847, you got 1860, and you know what happened in 1860, that is war, rebellion. And you know he was in North Carolina, which joined the wrong side of this rebellion. So the Confederate government, Confederate Army, hired him. I mean, he's a 13-year-old telegrapher. But not just any person in the Army. Somehow, again, I do not know all the details, but he caught the attention of Robert E. Lee himself, enough to be one of his personal telegraphers as an early teenager. 13 when the war started, 18 when it ended. Now, as he was 13 to 18, he did not see combat since, again, he was relaying messages to and from General Lee himself, who was number one in command of the Confederate Army. You can see copies of his transmissions online from his office. I listened to some, well, beep, 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 listen, but still. Now we know how the war turned out. It ended in 1865, and not only had teenage Sam been in the service of the Confederacy, he was also one of Lee's personal telegraphers. I think I counted four of them working in Robert E. Lee's home and his offices. Now, from 1865 to 1870, we can assume that he came to Lake Waccamaw in Columbus County because he is listed as living there with his brother Junius, his wife, and a boarder in the 1870 U.S. Census. It also lists the brothers as telegraph operators, with Samuel as head of house owning the property. So, what was a telegraph operator, or more accurately, two telegraph operators, doing in Lake Waccamaw? What was there that required two telegraph operators? Well, looking at the census record on the same page tells us two things. One, there is a railroad connecting Lake Waccamaw, as I mentioned earlier, to Wilmington. Number two, his neighbors worked in making shingles and turpentine, again, as mentioned earlier. Now, Lake Waccamaw is one of the Carolina Bay Lakes, perfectly round, naturally occurring lakes, of which White Lake and Jones Lake, as well as a couple in Johnston, also belong. The ecosystems, the soil and water of these lakes is quite unique, with most of them being cut off from other water sources, relying on rainwater runoff and swamp drainage to get their water. As such, the life development in these lakes also tends to resemble lakes of, or tends to not resemble lakes of other kinds. These lakes tend to be shallow, acidic, and the soil around it tends to be either sandy or swampy. Lake Waccamaw, therefore, had the benefit of being home to a tremendous number of pine trees because of the sandy soil, and cypress trees because of the swampiness of the area. Pine trees can also, and were forever, will be used for tar pitch and turpentine, all of which would be indispensable for a navy that was ready to reach out and become a global power after the Civil War. That means an increased, tremendously increased workforce in North Carolina's only real deep water port in Wilmington, which means more housing, which means more wood, which means more shingles on the roofs. And before the middle of the 20th century, cypress trees were the source of most of America's shingles. Cypress trees, a lot of them coming from Lake Waccamaw, owing to their resistance to water and their lightness of weight. It became the source of these materials, like Waccamaw did. Lumber mills processed pine and cedar all over the lake, with the materials bound for Wilmington on the railroad, because that's the only way to transport tons of them. And railroads need telegraph operators, and well, here's Sam at 23 years old filling that role. Good for him. So much lumber and naval stores were coming off of Lake Waccamaw that there were two separate companies running mills on this lake. And the lake is huge, but two full lumber mills on the lake, and the supply began to overtake the ability to transport it all, resulting in backlogs. Backlogs. Sorry about the pun. I guess our guy was a young prodigy like Sheldon. He definitely took advantage of opportunities when he saw them. Here he saw an opportunity. People have been trying to help with the backlog of building rafts and attempting to move these shingles and pine materials across the lake using poles for propulsion. Remember, Lake Waccamaw is kind of shallow. Sam, for his part, built a steam engine. Boy built a steam engine and a boat. Not to load up with these materials because that'd be too much for it'd be too heavy, it'd sink them, but to use that his steamboats as a tugboat for rafts to get the stuff from one side of the lake to another one. See? Genius. He even named his boat. He called his boat the Bohemian Girl, as I mentioned earlier. I don't know why, but he did. He also saw opportunity to take people fishing on this lake that were willing to pay to charter the boat. So when you're not towing cypress shingles and whatnot, tow people. They'll pay for fishing. We, again, newspaper article after newspaper article show people went to this guy and went fishing and then would had expeditions on the turn of the century. Now, people may also want to take a boat tour of Lake Waccamaw and hear the legends surrounding it. So Sam learned the legends and became a traveling narrator on the lake. From the stories from the Waccamaw Nation, from the origin stories, he thought he would tell those stories, and people would pay for that too. They did. He was right. And our guy Sam, boy genius like Sheldon from the TV show, operated the Bohemian Girl into the early 1900s. Oh, and our guy Sam, well, his last name was Potts, Sam Potts, as in the same last name as the actor Annie Potts that plays Meemaw Connie on the show Young Sheldon. They have the same last name because our guy Sam is her great grandfather. How about that? Full circle. And his wife Louise is her own great Meemaw, and Louise was from Johnston County, making Louise her great grandmother. How about that? I knew I liked Meemaw for some reason. And thanks for listening. Until next time, y'all be good.